accommodations, again, are sometimes I think they get sort of this negative reputation, and that's something that we're really passionate about, really discrediting, because accommodations are helpful. They help level the playing field, and they're also a lifelong skill that kids need to know how to accommodate themselves, how to support themselves. And that's a very positive skill for them to have.
We are the Childhood Collective, and we have helped thousands of overwhelmed parents find joy and confidence in raising their child with ADHD. I'm Katie, a speech language pathologist.
And I'm Lori.
And I'm Mallory, and we're both child psychologists. We combine the science of ADHD with the compassion of moms and bring you practical tools you can start using today.
So hit subscribe and let's help your family shine with ADHD. Today, I'm talking with Katie and Mallory about one of our favorite topics, school accommodations. We know when you drop your child with ADHD off at school each morning, you want to feel confident that they're going to have a happy and successful day.
My guess is that you might not be feeling that way right now. Maybe your child comes home exhausted from holding it together all day and then has a complete emotional breakdown. Or maybe you hold your breath every time your phone vibrates at work, crossing your fingers that it isn't another call from school.
According to the National Center on Learning Disabilities, a staggering 1 in 5 children in the U.S. have a learning or attention disorder, yet only a very small portion of these children are identified through the public school system and supported with a formal 504 plan or an IEP, which are these plans that provide accommodations and interventions at school.
Before we jump into all the myths about accommodations, let's first explain what they are exactly. So accommodations are designed to level the playing field for kids with ADHD. So a few examples of accommodations might include things like audiobooks instead of textbooks, not books on tape, which I want to say because that just always comes out whenever I'm talking to parents. I'm like, no, we don't use cassette tapes anymore. Extra time for testing, allowing your kids to use fidgets or wiggle seats in the classroom, allowing your child to stand at a desk, seating your child near their teacher, at the front of the classroom so they can easily redirect them, giving them headphones at school are all kind of different examples of accommodations. If you want other examples of accommodations that are specifically really helpful for kids with ADHD, make sure to check out our totally free school accommodations guide, which we will link in the show notes. But let's just talk a little bit about some of those myths around school accommodations.
Parents can be really hesitant to get accommodations because they get a bad rap. Parents get unsolicited advice from other people telling them their child is just lazy. They don't need accommodations at school. They just need to try harder. So there's a lot of myths around these accommodations that we kind of want to dispel today.
Absolutely. And really quickly, just to clear one thing up. So people ask a lot of times, how do I get accommodations? And do they need to be like on my IEP, my 504 plan? Do I need both? This is a lot to go into. And so big picture, accommodations can be written into a 504 plan. They can also be written into your child's IEP. And you would not have both a 504 plan and an IEP. You would have one or the other through your child's school. So if you're confused about that process, you are not alone. A lot of parents are confused, but it's just really important to understand accommodations are written down in a document that you and the teacher agree upon ways to support your child at school. And so, of course, one myth that we come up with a lot is people say, oh, accommodations give kids an unfair advantage. Mm-hmm. And that is probably one of my top pet peeves when I'm working in this field, because that is absolutely not the case. And the main reason for this is because kids with ADHD or other learning challenges, you don't just get accommodations for ADHD, but we're focused on that today. Their brains work differently, and they do not have the same executive functioning skills as other kids their age. Now, we can go into executive function all day long, but at the end of the day, executive functions are a set of skills in our brain that require us that are required for us to be successful with completing tasks. And as you can imagine, kids at school need a ton of executive functioning. They have to be flexible when the fire alarm goes off, even though they were about to read their favorite story. They have to self-regulate in the classroom. They can't blurt things out, they have to raise their hand. Sometimes the teacher might not call on them, even though they have something important that they really wanted to say. They have to be able to get started on boring tasks and sustain that attention for things like math facts, spelling tests. And this is requiring a ton of executive functioning for our kids, which is an area that if you followed us for a while, you know that this is really challenging for kids with ADHD. And so when we look at these accommodations, we are not giving kids an unfair advantage. We are actually supporting them and leveling the playing field to where they can function in the same way as their peers. It's the same way that we would give a child a ramp if they needed to go upstairs in their wheelchair. It's the same way that we would give a child with diabetes insulin, or a child who can't see, we would give them glasses. That's not an unfair advantage to have that child be able to read what's on the board. And no one would ever say that it is. So it's really an important analogy for parents to understand. Accommodations are incredibly important. One last thing on my soapbox is that adults use accommodations too. We use things like planners and schedules. My husband and I have a shared calendar. That's an accommodation that we both need because we'll double book things or get confused. Even with our shared calendar, we just signed our kids up for sports on the same day, 2 separate sports. And so accommodations.
Siri gives us lots of reminders at
Yes.
home. My husband would not be able to function
No.
without his reminders.
I can't cook or bake anything without a timer. And I use that timer to help me self-monitor because
Yep.
I put something in the oven and I walk away and then I get distracted. So accommodations, again, are sometimes I think they get sort of this negative reputation. And that's something that we're really passionate about, really discrediting, because accommodations are helpful. They help level the playing field. And they're also a lifelong skill that kids need to know how to accommodate themselves, how to support themselves. And that's a very positive skill for them to have.
Absolutely. I think that another myth that we hear commonly is that we don't need to accommodate these kids. We don't need to offer accommodations. They just need more discipline.
Mm-hmm.
They just need more punishment. And unfortunately, historically, schools have relied upon punishments for kids with ADHD when they're not meeting expectations. So things like taking away recess if they couldn't keep their body still earlier in the day, which is, of course, counterintuitive. Keeping them in from recess if they didn't finish the worksheet that they need to finish before math in the afternoon. Giving kids detentions, so taking them out of class and away from instruction to, pay for their behavior. And in some cases, even resorting to in-school or out-of-school suspensions for challenging behaviors that they're focused on the surface behavior, but they don't make the effort to kind of get to the root and really understand what the child's challenge is. And what accommodations do is they are designed to get to what is the root of the challenge and how do we support that child? How do we accommodate that child so that they're successful and that challenging behavior it's irrelevant at this point. It doesn't even need to happen. So for example, a child is repeatedly missing recess every day because they have too many wiggles. They're constantly out of their seat. So the solution is to make them stay in from recess and sit in a desk, learn how to sit in a desk, right? Punishment. An accommodation might be allowing that child to stand in their workspace or even freedom to kind of walk around and move within their workspace as long as they're still on task, or giving them more frequent movement breaks, giving them a wiggle seat. So these are all accommodations that kind of get to the root of the struggle. The root of the challenge here is that this child needs more opportunities for movement.
Mm-hmm.
More opportunities for movement help them regulate. And we're going to accommodate them proactively and give them those opportunities to regulate rather than punishing them and for kind of having that need. We can't punish away a child's need. We want to meet that need. We want to meet it proactively.
I feel like a lot of kids with ADHD really struggle with slower processing. Mm-hmm. And part of that is they just get distracted really easily. It's hard to sustain that attention. And with that slower processing, tasks can take a lot longer than other kids in the classroom. So they might be working on an assignment and they can only get one problem done where most of the class is at 3, 4, 5 problems. Mm-hmm. And so they're what ends up happening is they're taking that classwork that's not complete and having to finish it at recess or having to take it home and finish it. And so we're also looking at, like, does that child have slower processing? If so, we might need to cut back on the amount of problems that we're giving them in the classroom so that they can feel successful. They're still getting the practice that they need, but they're also getting the recess and the movement break they need, during the school day and after school, if we're just piling on extra homework. All right. So the next myth that we hear a lot from parents is that their grades are just too good. So the parents might have, you might have a diagnosis for your child and you go in and you want to get accommodations, but the school kind of says, well, they're getting A's and B's in the classroom. Like, we don't need to do accommodations.
We hear this so much. I think it's the school's first reaction more than half of the time.
Yep.
Because kids with ADHD are smart and can be very smart. And
yeah. And again, when we look at a 504 plan, for instance, we're looking at, does their diagnosis of ADHD impact different areas of their functioning? And one could be academic skills, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be their behavior. It can also be their executive functioning skills. It can also be their social skills, their emotional skills. So it's not just academics that we're looking at. In fact, the Office of Civil Rights had so many violations that would happen in schools where kids with ADHD really have had a history of not being properly accommodated, to the point where the Office of Civil Rights came out and wrote a letter to schools kind of saying, these are the issues that we're seeing. And one of those big issues was, kids are getting good grades. We're not going to offer a 504 plan. And their response was really, if a child has ADHD, they really need to have an accommodation plan at school, period. Because if they have that diagnosis, we know that they are impacted in their behavior and their executive functioning skills. So again, that's really an important thing to keep in mind. Maybe, we see lots of instances. Like, I had a little girl that I was working with. And again, she's just really sweet and a people pleaser. And I went in and I observed her in the classroom, and, she could sustain attention and participate for maybe the first 5 minutes of class. And then she was doodling and drawing and not, doing the work she was supposed to be doing. Getting problems wrong when she did. And again, she could listen to the instruction at first, but then was really struggling. When I talked with her teacher on the phone, she was like, yeah, she's having emotional meltdowns like numerous times throughout the day. I can usually talk her out of it, but it would be over friendships at recess, over not being able to complete the work, trying to avoid the work. Was she getting good grades? Yes. But was the teacher having to manage multiple tantrums throughout the day with a classroom of 30 kids? Yes. And her teacher was recognizing, yeah, this is really impacting her in the classroom. But there was a history there of having a diagnosis and the school not accommodating because the grades were good. So it's not a good reason to not have a 504 plan.
And I think something that is common for the families that are kind of walking through our door looking for an evaluation, and maybe we see them years later, and maybe some of you parents can relate to this, is that in the early years, kids who are very smart and have ADHD can kind of pull through at school. They don't have to be paying attention 100% of the time to understand the concept. Some of these school concepts are just coming naturally to them. So they're still getting good grades. But 4th, 5th, 6th grade rolls around where the topics are a lot more complex.
Yep.
You're reading to learn rather than learning to read. Now you know how to read, and now you're needing to read to learn. And you really are needing to pay attention in class, take notes. And then we start to see grades impacted. Whereas before they weren't so much because they were smart, they were pulling through. But again, later elementary school into middle school, then we do start seeing grades impacted. And gosh, we wish we could have done something sooner.
And even in those younger years, again, kinder, first, second, the classrooms are really set up in a way to accommodate that kids are just figuring out how to sit still. So they're moving to the floor and they're going back up to their desk and they're transitioning and making changes throughout the day. And they're doing fun activities and they're doing crafts. And it's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more fun and engaging. As kids get older, the expectation is to focus longer and do things that are hard, and those fun crafts are kind of going away. So it is harder to sustain focus and attention.
I was volunteering in my son's kindergarten classroom just yesterday, and they have this new free play center. It's like this whole camping center, and there's all these trees and a camper, and it's really cute. And my son's teacher was explaining how some of her old students, fourth and fifth graders, stopped into her room to check it out, and they all made the comment like, oh, we wish we could come back. Like, we want to play in the camping center. But it just highlights how kindergarten, gosh, the expectations and what the day looks like is so different from fourth and fifth graders. Whereas in kindergarten, they are getting those opportunities for free play and imagination. And the fifth graders are longing for that. They want to go back to those days. So it's challenging for kids with ADHD as they get older, as those expectations change.
Yep.
One thing I hear from my friends is that their kids often think boring tasks like chores or homework are going to take forever. And in the same breath, their kids can play 2 hours of Minecraft and then complain that they just got started.
Okay, I think that friend you're referring to might actually be me.
I'm not naming names. One tool we all love and have in our own homes is Time Timer.
At this point, I think we all have multiple time timers. For kids with ADHD, time can be a very abstract concept, and Time Timer helps by making time more concrete. It helps kids visually see the passage of time.
And it can prevent those inevitable meltdowns when 2 hours of Minecraft just wasn't justification enough to ask your child to complete 5 minutes of chores.
From homework to chores to screen time to daily hygiene to our own work, we love Time Timer because it is so versatile, and their designs are cute too. A staple in our homes.
If you have a child with ADHD, we know you need a time timer, and we have a discount code for you to use. So head to timetimer.com and use the code TCC to get the discount. You can also find the link and code in the show notes.
I think that is a really good connection to the next myth, which is that if the teacher is already doing accommodations in class, I don't need a formal accommodation plan. I don't need to write it down. And we will hear this from teachers. We go to IEP meetings all the time, and we hear from usually the veteran teachers who have a lot of experience, but will say, hey, I don't need an accommodation plan to tell me what to do. But we always encourage families to push for that accommodation plan through a 504 or the IEP because of this exact reason. As kids get older, there's more and more taxing on their executive functions. And another thing I was thinking of when you ladies were talking is even the idea of switching classrooms and having to make sure that you get, your first 3 periods of books in your locker, and then you have to get these things out, and I need to remember that I have a quiz in this class. And all of a sudden it's not just one teacher, one planner every day, but now maybe you have 5, 6 teachers throughout the day. And so the sooner we can get accommodations in place, the better it usually turns out for kids, because as they get older, it's going to get harder. The language is going to get more complicated. You're going to be doing a lot less remembering facts like math facts and spelling words, and a lot more really reasonable and critical thinking. And that can be really taxing for kids with ADHD for writing, for being able to construct a 5-paragraph essay that has a beginning and 3 main points and supporting details. All of this, there's a big jump that happens, and there's a couple actually, but 3rd grade tends to be a really big jump, and then middle school tends to be a huge jump as well.
Yeah. I actually got a text from one of my friends last night, and she was like, oh my gosh, my son's kindergarten teacher, it's her last day tomorrow. And like, they just told everyone. And I think about that, really in the last few years, there's been a lot of teacher turnover. I know last year my daughter was in kindergarten and we went through like multiple teachers.
I remember that.
So hard, especially when our kids are really young. But I also think about, again, when we think about an accommodation plan and that teacher maybe has known your child and was implementing all these things, and you had discussions and conversations, and then all of a sudden a day, you find out in a day that teacher's gone and you have a new one, but there's no plan in place.
Right.
There's no plan saying these are the things that we were doing.
Absolutely.
These are the things that were working. So the next teacher who comes in can see that, and it's an easier transition for everyone.
Yeah. So our usual response in IEP meetings when a teacher says, hey, I don't really need to write this down, I'm actually doing these accommodations and they're going so well, we always say, like, that is so great.
Yep.
Let's document it.
Yep.
And that's a really important thing for parents to feel empowered to understand, like, you have the right to request that. And the ADHD diagnosis qualifies your child for a 504 plan. And so starting those conversations and just feeling confident that even if the teacher is great and it's working really well, you want to lean into that and make sure that you're documenting what is going so well.
And it can be hard to speak up at those meetings when they're saying, no, we don't need to do this, because it is extra paperwork and it's extra meetings and things like that. But we want to really encourage you that you have to be an advocate for your child. You have to educate yourself, and you have to go into those meetings knowing what that you're going to have to speak up for your child. You have to be their voice. To say what is going to help them and do what's best for them, because not everyone is going to be keeping that in mind. There's lots of other things that are going on that are pressing on people's time. And again, you have to just do what's best for your child.
And if you're wondering, if you're kind of overwhelmed by all of this and you're like, oh my gosh, they referenced the OCR and I'm not really sure.
Office of Civil Rights.
The Office of Civil Rights, OCR. We actually, in the show notes, will have a lot of resources for you.
Yep.
So check that out, because there is a copy of that letter that the Office of Civil Rights wrote. And there's also a blog
summary,
post connected to it where we summarize the main takeaways. And I think that's calling our name for another podcast episode.
Yes, we'll have to talk about that in particular, because that's a really important topic.
Absolutely. We're kind of skimming the surface here of accommodations and just setting the table of these are the things that we want to make sure everyone is on the same page about. But yeah, those are in the show notes. So if you want to check that out and read through that, some light reading for your evening, that's a good one. But we're going to also talk about one more myth that often gets dispersed.
Yeah. So another myth that we hear is that if your child is given accommodations at school, that they won't learn the skills that they need to be prepared for high school or be prepared for college, that kind of they're going to use it as a crutch and they're not going to be ready. And my argument is in the opposite direction. If we don't properly accommodate kids, they're not going to be ready for high school or college, because how much instruction will they have accessed?
Mm-hmm.
They'll have struggled throughout elementary and middle school without proper supports. All of their kind of mental energy is going towards focusing and staying on tasks and not getting in trouble, and it's getting in the way of learning. And that's why they're not ready for high school or for college. And something else to keep in mind is that kids can still have accommodations in high school. Yeah. Kids can still have accommodation, not kids anymore, but young adults can have accommodations in college also through a 504 plan. So those don't just like automatically get taken away as your child gets older. Absolutely, accommodations should grow and evolve with your child. And if an accommodation is no longer needed, then stop using it by all means. But as Katie touched upon earlier, adults use accommodations.
Yes.
We all use accommodations throughout our day. If we don't give our kids the opportunity in elementary school and middle school to learn what works for them, to learn what helps them in the classroom, to learn what helps them be successful, then they're not going to be able to be advocates for their needs once they get to high school and once they get to college, because they haven't been given the opportunity to learn how their brain works, why it works that way, and what helps. So by giving our child accommodations in elementary and middle school, we're teaching them what works and why it works, and really growing our child to be a successful advocate for themselves as they get older, which is the ultimate goal, right? We're not always going to be able to be there with them, telling the teacher what they need, walk into their first lecture hall and make sure the teacher knows that they need to sit at the front. So reserve that seat. We want our child to know what they need and what works for them so they can do that as they get older.
And I was just talking with a family this week, and one thing that they brought up that is a question that I get from parents all the time is if my child gets this diagnosis and there's a concern about like labels and getting a diagnosis or even sharing that with the school, are they going to have to share that with their job later on? Is the college that they're going to know that, and are they not going to accept them? The truth is that no jobs and no colleges are going to have any idea unless you like do the work to provide documentation of the need and accommodation. So it takes actually a lot of effort to let colleges or jobs know that that is going on. So if anything, having a history of those accommodations starting in elementary school when your child needs them, when you get to taking the ACT or SAT, I've had kids again take it without accommodations and they couldn't get it done in time. Again, that slow processing speed is a real thing, or the distractibility, and having to sit down to take a multiple hour test is really, really hard. But trying to access accommodations, if your child hasn't had a history of formal accommodations at school with a 504 plan or an IEP, it's going to be really hard to make an argument or for them to provide accommodations during those like really heavy tests that are really important and have, high stakes to them. They're not going to necessarily provide that. So that's really something else to keep in mind. There can be a lot of advantages for college and for getting even scholarships and things like that based on your scores, to have those proper accommodations.
That reminds me of a patient that I had years ago. He was making the transition from high school to university. He was a very excellent athlete, got accepted into a very prestigious university, but was growing very concerned about how he was going to keep up academically, kind of managing the athletic side of things, and then the very rigorous coursework at this university he was going to. And it was so helpful that I could go back through all of his records and document all of the accommodations that he had received over time, and that his ADHD diagnosis was from a very young age. And I did a reevaluation. We, affirmed that diagnosis. And it was so helpful that we had years and years of documentation showing that these are accommodations that he needed, because he was actually absolutely going to need those going into college to be successful at this university and manage all of the things. So if he hadn't had that history of a diagnosis, if he hadn't had that history of needing these accommodations, it was going to be a really rocky start to his college career.
Well, these are awesome myths that we hopefully busted for you about ADHD and school accommodation. So one key takeaway that I really want you to think about as we end this is most children with ADHD are going to need accommodations to be successful in school. So having a formal plan in place allows for consistency across teachers, across classes, and from year to year.
Thanks for listening to Shining with ADHD by your hosts, Lori, Katie, and Mallory of the Childhood Collective.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video and hit subscribe so you can be the first to know when a new episode airs.
If you are looking for links and resources mentioned in this episode, you can always find those in the show notes. See you next time.